Every era has its spark, the moment that tilts the world. Today, it was 4 letters. MIGA. Trump's hint at regime change in Iran wasn't just noise, it was a warning. And as the world holds its breath, what comes next may rewrite history. Stay with me, because the final truth reveals itself at the end. There are moments, rare and chilling, when the utterance of a mere handful of words from a singular powerful voice seems to bend the arc of history. Not a formal edict, not a declaration of war, but something far more insidious and perhaps more potent. A hint. A whisper carrying the audacious suggestion of toppling a government, of fundamentally remaking a nation from afar. When that whisper, attributed to a figure like Donald Trump, names a country like Iran, already a crucible of tension and ancient complexities, and when it is interwoven with phrases like MIGA, make Iran great again, an acronym now laden with assertive, even interventionist intent, the world is compelled to listen, to brace. For such a hint of regime change, especially against the backdrop of direct military strikes and ongoing retaliation, is not just a rhetorical flourish. It becomes a live current in an already electrified geopolitical landscape, a potential catalyst for events whose consequences could dwarf even the immediate fires of conflict. It is a pronouncement that forces allies and adversaries alike into urgent calculation, raising the stakes for a United States finding itself increasingly embroiled, compelled to brace for the unpredictable and likely furious repercussions that such ambitions invariably unleash upon those who voice them and those who are targeted by them. This is not about abstract policy, it's about the tangible fear and furious anticipation that ripple outward when the specter of externally forced transformation is invoked. Potent whisper, the very phrase, regime change, when it emanates from the highest echelons of a global superpower, possesses an almost gravitational pull, altering the orbits of nations and the calculations of leaders. It is more than just a diplomatic term. It is a declaration of profound dissatisfaction, not merely with a nation's policies, but with its very system of governance, its leadership, its sovereign identity. When coupled with a slogan like MIGA, Make Iran Great Again, in this context, it transcends even that. It implies not just a desire for internal transformation, but a belief, an assertion that this greatness can or even must be imposed or guided from the outside by the United States. This is a notion that, to the ears of the targeted state, Iran, sounds less like an offer of assistance and more like a declaration of intent to interfere, to destabilize, perhaps even to dismantle. History is replete with examples, some successful by certain metrics, many others leading to prolonged chaos, power vacuums, and unintended blowback that lasts for generations. The whisper of regime change, therefore, is received in Tehran not as a constructive critique, but as an existential threat, a signal that the ultimate goal of American pressure may not be negotiation or containment, but eradication. This perception fundamentally alters Iran's strategic calculus. The incentive to compromise dwindles when faced with what appears to be a maximalist demand for capitulation or overthrow. It fosters a bunker mentality, a resolve to resist at all costs, and a willingness to countenance extreme measures for self-preservation. For the United States, allowing such a potent whisper to take root in its declared or implied foreign policy means committing to a path fraught with immense peril. It means bracing for a level of resistance from Iran that goes far beyond diplomatic protest or conventional military skirmishes. It means preparing for asymmetrical warfare, for proxy conflicts intensifying, for economic warfare escalating into real-world violence. The MIGA slogan, so resonant domestically for some in America, takes on an entirely different, more ominous meaning on the international stage when applied to forcibly reshaping another sovereign entity. It can be interpreted as a form of ideological imperialism, a belief in the universal applicability of one's own model, even if it must be installed by force. This kind of rhetoric pushes Iran further into the embrace of other global powers skeptical of American intentions, like Russia and China, and solidifies alliances with non-state actors who share a common adversary. The domestic political utility of such a phrase clashes violently with its international strategic consequences, creating a dangerous disconnect. The United States, by hinting at such profound ambitions, inadvertently signals to Iran that all gloves are off, forcing it to prepare for a no-holds-barred defense of its system, compelling the U.S. in turn to brace for responses born not of pique, but of perceived existential necessity. This dynamic shifts the very nature of the confrontation, making de-escalation exponentially more difficult. Burning ground. This ominous hint of regime change and the MIGA declaration did not emerge in a vacuum. They landed upon a terrain already scorched by direct fiery military confrontation, an environment where the language of diplomacy was increasingly drowned out by the roar of explosions. American and Israeli forces had conducted precision airstrikes against critical Iranian nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, Esfahan, sites central to Iran's national pride and strategic planning. These were not mere symbolic gestures, but significant, damaging attacks perceived by Tehran as grave provocations, if not acts of war. Simultaneously, parallel strikes targeted Iranian military and government installations, including IRGC command sites, intensifying the pressure. Iran, in turn, fired back. Its missiles and drones arched across the skies towards Israel, causing tangible infrastructure damage in major urban centers like Tel Aviv and inflicting injuries. This immediate kinetic exchange was the fierce reality against which Trump's words gained their terrifying resonance. The rhetoric of MIGA and regime change wasn't an abstract policy debate. It was being interpreted in the context of ongoing bombs and casualties. For Iran, it suggested that these strikes were not just punitive or deterrent measures, but potentially the opening salvos of a larger campaign aimed at systemic overthrow. This perception fundamentally changes the stakes. Every American action, every Israeli operation, is scrutinized through this new, harsher lens. Is this merely a response to past Iranian provocations, or is it part of a deliberate strategy to weaken the state in preparation for its dismantling? This ambiguity, fueled by the regime change whispers, compels Iran to consider worst-case scenarios and to plan its responses accordingly. The United States, therefore, must brace for a retaliation that is not just proportionate to the latest strikes, but one that anticipates a potentially much larger, existential threat. If Iran believes it is fighting for its survival as a republic, its leaders are likely to authorize measures far more drastic and far-reaching than if they perceived the conflict to be a limited exchange over specific policy disagreements. The burning ground of current hostilities thus becomes a furnace for Iran's resolve, and a stark warning to the U.S. that fanning the flames with rhetoric of externally imposed transformation will likely lead to an even greater conflagration. The decision by any American leader to float such notions at a time of active military exchange is akin to throwing gasoline on an already raging fire, escalating the risk of uncontrolled spread and making any attempt at firefighting infinitely more dangerous and complex for all involved. Retaliation vowed. The response from Tehran to the combined pressures of military strikes and the looming specter of Trump-inspired regime change was unequivocal and chilling. Iranian parliamentary figures and senior military leaders did not speak of de-escalation or seeking mediation. Instead, they vowed a proportionate response. But in the context of a perceived existential threat embodied by the MIGA ethos directed at their overthrow, proportionate takes on a far more severe meaning. Their warnings became specific and deeply alarming. The United States, they declared, risked losing access to the Strait of Hormuz, the critical maritime artery through which a vast portion of global oil supplies transit. To threaten this choke point is to threaten global economic stability, an act of brinkmanship that signals Iran's willingness to inflict widespread international pain if it feels pushed too far. This isn't merely a military tactic. It's economic warfare designed to demonstrate that the consequences of pushing for regime change could be catastrophic well beyond Iran's borders. The message to Washington, and indeed the world, was stark. If Iran's system is to be toppled, the cost will be exorbitant for everyone. Furthermore, Iran declared all United States military bases across the entire Middle Eastern region to be legitimate targets. This was a direct challenge to American power projection, transforming every U.S. soldier and facility in the vicinity into a potential point of retaliation. This explicit threat vastly expands the potential scope of conflict, forcing the United States to brace not for a localized engagement, but for a dispersed, multi-front challenge to its regional presence. These are not the actions of a state contemplating minor adjustments to its foreign policy. They are the desperate calculations of a regime that believes it is being targeted for destruction. The MIGA slogan, in this Iranian interpretation, becomes a direct call for its demise, and the vowed retaliation is thus framed as a defense of national survival. The U.S. military, its allies, and indeed global commerce must then prepare for scenarios ranging from missile attacks on bases and shipping to cyber warfare and an intensified campaign of asymmetric attacks through Iran's regional proxies. The vow of retaliation is a direct consequence of escalating rhetoric meeting military action. When regime change is hinted at, the targeted regime logically concludes it has little left to lose by contemplating actions that would otherwise be considered unthinkable, forcing the aggressor to brace for the whirlwind it has sown. Diplomacy's demise. The devastating impact of combining direct military strikes with hints of regime change, all under a banner like MIGA, was perhaps most starkly illustrated in the realm of diplomacy. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, delivered a scathing assessment. The U.S. actions had blown up any ongoing diplomatic efforts, particularly those being carefully nurtured with European nations. This was not hyperbole. It was a declaration that the fundamental basis for trust and negotiation had been obliterated. How can one engage in good faith dialogue with a party that is simultaneously bombing one's sensitive facilities and, through powerful implication, signaling an intent to overthrow one's government? For Tehran, such a proposition was untenable. Araghchi's accusation that the U.S. had deliberately derailed these talks, and his insistence that diplomacy was now off the table, signified a profound shift. It meant that Iran, feeling existentially threatened, saw no further utility in words when actions seemed to speak of a far more sinister American agenda. The perceived pursuit of MIGA by toppling the Iranian government rendered all other discussions moot. This collapse of diplomatic channels is a critical component of what the United States must brace for. Without established lines of communication, the risk of miscalculation multiplies exponentially. Every military movement, every intelligence report, is more likely to be interpreted in the most negative light, increasing the chances of an unintended slide into wider conflict. Scheduled peace talks were canceled. High-level engagements were shelved. Iran stated it must receive a response, implying a military or retaliatory one, before diplomacy could even be contemplated again. This forces the international community, including U.S. allies in Europe who sought to mediate, into a deeply uncomfortable position. Their efforts to bridge divides were effectively nullified by actions they likely viewed as counterproductive and dangerously escalatory. The notion of "make Iran great again," through regime change, effectively communicates to Tehran that there is no common ground to be found, no negotiated settlement that would satisfy Washington short of total capitulation or systemic collapse. The result is a diplomatic wasteland where the only viable language seems to be that of force and counterforce. The U.S., in choosing this path, must therefore brace not only for kinetic Iranian retaliation, but also for a deep, perhaps prolonged, diplomatic isolation on this specific issue, as even allies question the wisdom of a strategy that preemptively destroys the avenues for peaceful resolution. Shifting sands, faced with what it perceived as an American ambition for regime change, underscored by the MIGA declaration, Iran naturally intensified its efforts to secure alternative alliances and leverage its existing network of regional proxies. The high-profile consultations between Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi and Russian President Vladimir Putin were a clear manifestation of this strategic pivot. Moscow, with its own complex relationship with Washington and its significant influence in the Middle East, presented itself as a key partner for an Iran feeling increasingly cornered. These discussions likely explored enhanced military technical cooperation, avenues to mitigate the impact of U.S. sanctions, and coordinated diplomatic strategies to counter American pressure in international forums. Similarly, expressions of solidarity from China signaled another crucial lifeline, as Beijing also views American unilateralism with suspicion and has vested economic and strategic interests in the region that align with the degree of Iranian stability, albeit on its own terms. This consolidation of ties with Eastern powers is a direct response to perceived Western aggression aimed at overthrowing Tehran's government. The United States, by hinting at such a profound goal, inadvertently pushed Iran further into the embrace of its geopolitical rivals. Simultaneously, the threat of externally imposed regime change galvanizes Iran's proxy network. Groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, ideologically aligned and often materially supported by Tehran, view an existential threat to their patron as an existential threat to themselves. In such a scenario, their role shifts from mere extensions of Iranian influence to crucial components of a decentralized defense and retaliatory strategy. The U.S. must therefore brace for the mobilization of these groups, anticipating coordinated or opportunistic attacks across multiple fronts, from Lebanon and Palestine to Yemen and Iraq. This vastly complicates the strategic picture, transforming a potential bilateral confrontation into a sprawling, multifaceted regional conflict. International leaders from the UN, EU, and Arab states have rightly voiced grave concerns about this spiraling dynamic, warning that the entire region risks being dragged into a devastating full-scale war. The MIGA slogan, intended perhaps for a domestic American audience, translates into a dangerously destabilizing policy when perceived internationally as a commitment to toppling foreign governments. It shifts the sands of regional power dynamics, creating new fault lines and empowering actors who thrive on instability, all while the United States must prepare for the wider, more chaotic repercussions of its own powerful, nation-altering whispers. Final reckoning, the path chosen when a nation hints at overthrowing another, especially when it is a major regional power like Iran, and the words are backed by military strikes and a charged slogan like MIGA, is one laden with profound and unpredictable dangers. The United States, by allowing such ambitions to color its posture, commits itself to bracing for a retaliation born not just of anger, but of a desperate fight for survival. This is not a contest of limited aims. It is perceived by the targeted state as an all-or-nothing struggle. The vow from Tehran to make U.S. bases legitimate targets, the threat to global oil supplies via the Strait of Hormuz, and the declaration that diplomacy is dead are not mere rhetoric. They are the grim signposts on a road to deeper conflict. The very notion of making Iran great again through externally forced regime change fundamentally misunderstands the nature of sovereignty, nationalism, and the complex internal dynamics of any society. Such ambitions often achieve the opposite, unifying a populace against foreign interference and entrenching the very regimes they seek to depose, or, if successful in removal, creating power vacuums that breed chaos and extremism for decades to come. The ultimate measure of a nation's greatness lies not in its capacity to impose its will upon others, nor in its ability to dismantle foreign governments through force or coercion. True greatness is found in the wisdom to foster stability, the courage to engage in genuine diplomacy even with adversaries, and the moral clarity to recognize that the pursuit of security and prosperity for one's own people should not and cannot sustainably come at the expense of the fundamental rights and sovereignty of others. The perilous course set by hints of regime change requires a profound recalibration, a return to principles that value coexistence over conquest and dialogue over destruction. To truly brace for the consequences is to understand the terrifying potential of unleashed furies, and to earnestly seek every available off-ramp before the point of no return is crossed, lest the ambition to remake another nation in one's own image leads only to a shared descent into a darker, more fractured world for all.